This video is about the process of succession. By the end of this video, you should know that ecosystems are dynamic systems, which means that they're changing. We should understand the process of primary succession from colonisation by pioneer species through to development of a climax community. You should know that at each stage in succession, species may be recognised which change the environment so that it becomes more suitable for other species with different adaptations. And then the new species may change the environment in such a way that it becomes less suitable for the previous species. Changes that organisms produce in their abiotic environment, which means their non-living environment, can result in a less hostile environment and change biodiversity. And conservation of habitats frequently involves management of succession. So let's start with the definition of succession. So succession is the evolution of plant communities at a site over time from pioneer species to climax vegetation. So evolution means change in plant communities, and don't forget that communities are populations of different species which occupy a particular habitat. So we're talking about different plant species populations. Okay, so at each stage of succession, the plant community alters the soil and microclimate, allowing establishment of another group of species. One community of plants is therefore replaced by another as succession develops. And eventually, a climax community is reached where the vegetation is in a state of equilibrium with the environment and there is no further influx of new species. Okay, so we're going to look at each of these points separately and talk about them a little bit more. So the reason we've got a diagram here of sand dunes is because, as it says up here, you can see all the stages of succession as you walk inland from a beach. So if you start at the sea and walk inland, the first dunes that you reach will be the youngest dunes and therefore in the earliest stages of succession. And as you move further inland, away from the sea, you will see dunes which are older dunes. They've been there for a longer period of time and therefore they're in later stages of succession. And eventually, if you walk far enough inland, you should reach a woodland, which would be the climax community. So these are the very oldest dunes and have reached the final stage in that process of succession. Another way that you could observe succession is if you observe bare land over time. And this could be, for example, even something as straightforward as, a disused parking lot, for example, or somewhere where a building has been demolished and it's been left as a sort of empty site. You can see, if you keep looking at that area, you would be able to see the process of succession. Initially, it would just be tarmac, for example, or bare ground, but then there would be plants growing in that area, and at different stages of the process of succession, there would be different plants over time. Okay? So, what happens if you look at succession is that as succession occurs, or as it progresses, that species richness increases. Don't forget, species richness is the number of different species in an area. So, for example, in the very young dunes near the sea, there would be relatively low species richness, just a few species which are able to withstand very harsh conditions, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. As you reach the climax community then, the very latter stages of succession, you would have much higher species richness, a greater number of different species, and therefore you'd have greater biodiversity. You'd also have greater amount of soil, so depth of soil, and within that soil you'd have a greater percentage of organic matter or humus, and you'd also have a higher nutrient content in the soil, nitrates and phosphates, for example. Okay, so there's two different types of succession that we can see occurring in nature. We can see succession, which is called primary succession. Primary succession happens in new habitats. In other words, it occurs in areas where there have been no community of living organisms before. For example, bare rock, sand. Alternatively, we can see something called secondary succession. And secondary succession is in an area where there has been a community of living things in the past, but there's been some sort of a disturbance, for example, a fire or a flood. So if we're looking at secondary succession, after the fire or flood, there may still be some organic material, there may be some soil, there may be seeds in the soil, for example. So secondary succession happens much more quickly than primary succession, where there hasn't been any life in the past. And the changes in the biotic or living community follow a process called succession. So, as we've already said, succession is a change in the composition of species that occupy a particular area through time. It involves initial colonisation by pioneer plant species, followed by their replacement with other species until a relatively stable community is formed. Okay, so the communities that remain stable over long periods of time are called climax communities. So these are our stable communities with the high biodiversity that we were talking about before and the high species richness. And they can be, for example, mature woodlands, forests, grasslands, for example. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more in a minute about these pioneer plant species and why they're so special. But this is really important. Each stage of succession is called a seer. This is a key word. So the key thing to realise is that at each stage, the community of living things, so in other words, the plants and possibly microorganisms, fungi, possibly some animals as well, that live in the environment, change their environment and create conditions that favour the growth of other species, so that actually they change their environment and therefore they are then outcompeted by other species which are more well adapted to that new environment, that changed environment. Okay, if we have a look at this slide, again we're using sand dunes as an example of an illustration of the process of succession. This would be an example of primary succession because when sand dunes are formed, there's been nothing living there before, so there have been no living things in that habitat beforehand. And again, we can see, if you look at the information in the table, this shows you the age of the sand dunes. So we can see the sand dunes closest to the sea are the younger sand dunes at 0 to 65 years in terms of development, whereas if we go to the far right of the diagram, the oldest dunes, the ones which are furthest from the sea, are more than 365 years old. So that process of succession has been happening for all that time. If we go back again over to the left here to these very young dunes where it talks about the early stages of succession, at this stage, or this seer of the process of succession, it's abiotic factors or non-living factors really which determine which species can colonise this environment. It's a very harsh environment, and that's because there's no organic matter in the soil, there's no humus in the soil to hold water, so plants here have to be adapted to very low water levels. It's very harsh in terms of wind from the sea. There's none or very little nutrient content in the soil, and that's because of the fact that there hasn't been anything living there in the past. So the plants which are able to survive in these very, very harsh conditions are called the pioneer species, and the pioneer species are the first to be able to colonise in that area. Or if there's a number of those different plant species, then that would be the pioneer community. The crucial thing to realise about succession is that those pioneer species, by their presence there, when they die, when they start to be decomposed and decay, they will change the habitat because there will then be more organic material in the soil. There will be some nutrients in the soil. The soil will start to increase in depth. It'll be able to hold water. And therefore, that change in the environment means, which has happened because of the presence of those plants, those pioneer plants, makes the area less hospitable now for other plant species. So other plant species are able to outcompete the pioneer species. Other species may be more well adapted now than those pioneer species to the conditions, and therefore they're able to grow there. So we then get to the areas, you can see here you would have other species like heather and gorse, for example, able to then outcompete those pioneer species, things like sea spurge, sea holly, marram grass, etc. And like we say, that process continues over time, and you can see by looking at this table at the bottom, you can see how the pH of the soil eventually decreases, how the soil colour becomes more grey, brown, in other words, the colour of soil as opposed to the colour of sand. And this is an important one at the bottom, the humus, the organic content as a percentage. It goes from 0.2 in the very young dunes, where the pioneer species colonise, to more than 40% in the climax community. So the climax community shown here on the right is a woodland. It's birch, pine, oak, high species diversity, high species richness, because it's the climax community, the relatively stable community. Okay, and at those latter stages of succession that we were just talking about, it's more biotic factors such as competition between different species which determine which species colonise this much less harsh environment. Okay, this slide is just showing you a little bit more detail in terms of names of species that might be present at different stages or sears of succession. Again, we're going from barren terrain on the left towards a climax forest or climax community on the right. This particular diagram shows the species which would be present at different stages or sears of succession, starting with bare rock. Because if you look at the pioneers, the soil builders, the pioneer species, in this case lichen, lichen are one of the first species which can grow on bare rock. And like we say, don't forget that at each stage or sear, the species present, the community, are changing their environment and creating conditions that then favour the growth of other species. And once those other species are able to grow, they very often are more well adapted than the previous species and outcompete the previous species in those areas. This also shows you plants, and you can see, as well as plants, it shows animals, and you can see that there's a change in animal communities as well as succession occurs. Okay. On this slide, we can see a diagram showing secondary succession. Don't forget that secondary succession occurs in areas where there has previously been a community of living things, but it's been disturbed. So it could have been by a forest fire or by floods. And notice that it says here secondary succession is completed. In other words, it reaches climax community in less time, so more quickly than primary succession. And that's because there's already some soil and organic matter already present. So things like seeds, for example, may already be present in the soil, or seeds from nearby communities may blow in and quickly colonise the area because there is some organic material. So there's already some soil, there's some humus, the nutrients available for those plant communities. So we still get a series of sears or stages until we reach a climax community, but it's just that those sears or stages would occur more quickly. Okay, for example, this one, it shows here secondary succession in this abandoned agricultural field takes about 120 years to develop from pioneer annual plants to the climax woodland community. Whereas if you compare that to the sand dunes that we were looking at earlier, it was showing that process in over 350 years. Okay, the final slide then just shows you key terms and key points about the process of succession, which we've covered in this presentation. We should now understand what primary and secondary succession is and the difference between them. We should know what pioneer species are, the fact that they're adapted to very harsh conditions, and that the pioneer species make up the pioneer community, and that community, by its very existence, will change the environment and make it more hospitable for other plant species to be able to live there. Adaptations of pioneers, so we talked about the pioneer species being able, for example, to exist where there's very few nutrients in the soil, where there might be very little water. They may, for example, have very long roots to reach the water table. etc. Remember that sears are the different stages of the process of succession, and that at each sear there are specific species present, and that the presence of those species is changing the environment and making it less hospitable for other species, and actually might make it so that the species themselves are less well adapted to those conditions. Intermediate communities are what we get between the pioneer community and the climax community, so they're just different sears. The climax community, remember, is that relatively stable community, usually a woodland, for example, or mature grassland, where it's relatively stable and there's no new influx of new plant species. It's a relatively stable community with very high biodiversity and high species richness. We didn't really speak about deflected succession or plagioclimax, but this can occur when, for example, it's usually when man intervenes in some way in the process of succession. So, for example, if you've got a field which is being grazed by cattle or grazed by sheep, you're deflecting succession. You're stopping that process of succession, because every time new plant species start to grow, they're going to be grazed upon by the grazing animals. It could also be as simple as, you've got a field which is being regularly mowed. It could be a field where you're applying weed killers, for example. So it's usually some sort of human intervention that's involved in deflecting succession or creating what's called a plagioclimax. In other words, that particular area wouldn't reach a natural climax community. Okay, we've talked about biotic and abiotic factors, living factors and non-living factors that might affect what can grow in these different habitats, these different areas. We've talked about changes to biomass, productivity, biodiversity. So we've mentioned changes in biodiversity as we go from pioneer community to climax community. There's also a change in biomass. In other words, biomass increases as we go from pioneer community to climax community. As you can imagine, in a climax community where you've got large trees, you're going to have a greater biomass. You're also going to have greater productivity. In other words, greater rates of photosynthesis per unit area. Okay, we've looked at, we haven't really talked about measuring changes in an ecosystem. One of the slides did show some measurements that could be taken, things like amount of organic material in the soil, pH of the soil. This could be done by doing something like, for example, a transect through the area. You could also look at measuring changes in populations of plants by at regular intervals placing down a quadrat next to the transect line and measuring the abundance of various different species at different points along that transect line. Okay, so there's different ways that you could measure those changes. Okay, and we've talked about some examples of succession. We've talked about examples of primary succession, for example, from bare rock to woodland or from sand to woodland. And we've also looked at an example of secondary succession from, say, for example, an abandoned field to woodland.